Once again, this is Lita Downs from the Office of Teaching and Learning Excellence, and I will be your moderator today during this session that's part of the College of Management and Human Potential Virtual Symposium. Our presenter, Dr. Roger Mayer, will be discussing his research today on transitioning to international public sector accounting standards, IPSAS, in emerging market countries. Dr. Mayer is part of our Doctor of Business Administration here in Walden University, and he's part of that program and has been a part of that program since 2009. So we want to welcome you, Dr. Mayer. It's so great to have you presenting this information today. I'm going to turn things over to you.
Okay, so good afternoon. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Thank you very much for listening to me live, and people have promised me that they're going to be listening to this presentation in the remote recorded environment. So thank you very much for your participation. As was mentioned, I'm part of the contributing faculty at Walden, which means that I actually have time to do other things. One of which is that I myself, as well as my wife, Dr. Chen, who is also a contributing faculty at Walden, have been working as consultants with several emerging market countries in Africa related to this transition to international public sector standards, or what we call IPSAS. And what we're wanting to do today, what I'm wanting to do today is really sort of provide an understanding of what IPSAS is, why it's important, what our role has been, and how we're actually able to help emerging market countries as they are moving towards more sophisticated accounting standards in their country. So if you can move to the next slide. Let's just sort of talk through what IPSAS is. So IPSAS consists of 42 specific standards related to the presentation and reporting of public sector entity using accrual accounting. So what specifically are we talking about? We are talking about the national accounts of the country. So essentially within a country, there are numerous ministries. These flow up into the Treasury Department that is actually then monitoring and providing the payments for services, accumulating debt and making payments. And what the standards really help is that the goal of these standards is to provide essentially the overreaching general purpose financial statements of the country. And these are then going to be used by external stakeholders. One of the very interesting things related to the reason why IPSAS has been a significant push within these countries is other governmental bodies, such as the United Nations, the World Bank, others that provide funding to countries. Is what we're looking for is we're looking for a degree of transparency and reporting such that these donors are able to actually see what's taking place within the country and what's taking place with the funds that they're being provided. The IPSAS standards are actually created by what we call the International Public Sector Accounting Standard Board. If you think about in the United States, we have generally accepted accounting principles. Those are coming from FASB. The international standards are coming from the ISA, and the IPSAS standards are actually created based upon the international standards. But the difference is that they are directly related to public sector. So again, when we think about public sector, we're talking about governmental agencies that are in fact creating value for the citizenry of the country. And we are reporting based upon the idea that we are actually creating value for the stakeholders in terms of transparency and so forth, which we'll get into if we go to the next slide. So what we see in the next slide is So this is a very, very long process. It's very time consuming. It requires resources. There's a lot of things that are, you'll see that there's a lot of sort of moving parts in this process to get to where we need to be. So the question becomes, so why do we do this? What are the benefits? What are the social benefits? What is the societal impact of adopting IPSAS standards? And some of these include providing consistency, comparability, and the reliability of financial statements. One of the very interesting things that we've discovered as we're working with these countries is that, you know what, they're not really providing financial information at any depth. Basically, what they're doing is they're reporting the budget, and that's about it. So there's not a lot of financial reporting. So for the citizens of the country, for the stakeholders, vendors, donors, and so forth, they're not actually able to see what's actually taking place. The next piece relates to the enhanced oversight and internal control process. As an example, we're in we'll talk about this later on. We're working with the country right now. We actually had a couple-hour session this morning related to the transition to IPSAS and how that this transition is actually forcing them to think about internal controls, to think about oversight, to think about the transfer of information so that they can actually present the financial statements. The very fact that we're actually doing that they're in this process, in and of itself, the process actually creates value for these individuals. Certainly increased transparency over assets and liabilities. Again, what they're reporting on now is using cash transactions. Cash goes in, they have revenue, cash goes out, they have an expense. In an accrual system, it's forcing you to look at assets and liabilities. So as an example, fixed assets are not really covered in a cash-based transaction. So in an accrual-based transaction, we actually can identify assets that create value for the country. And on the flip side, we're not tracking liabilities in a cash-based system. Once we create the accrual-based accounting mechanisms, the country actually has the ability to understand what is truly owed to outside parties outside of the country. So the ability to understand the financial position increases exponentially. Certainly, the ability to capture information about costs through an increased quality control system and IT system gives us more information about costing. And this information will enhance the budgetary process. And then finally, obviously, this relates to our quality of financial reporting. Okay, so if you want to move to the next slide. So we talk about quality financial reporting. And when we are at the point where we are in compliance with IPSAS, we are actually able to receive an audit opinion that essentially says we are in compliance with IPSAS, and that basically says the financial statements present fairly the financial position of the country. This will increase the credibility and the reliability of the financial statements and increase donor confidence. One of the things that we clearly have seen, not only in these projects, but in other projects, is that anytime you are expecting donors to contribute either with loans or direct assistance, they want to make sure that that money is actually used wisely. A fully compliant IPSAS financial statement gives us that ability to show what's actually taking place. Now, in the next bullet point, we talk about the transition. So one of the very interesting things that is embedded in the IPSAS standards is the recognition of the fact that we are at a place before we start the process where we're reporting on cash, we don't have the systems in place. What IPSAS is able to do is to give us a guidelines, guidance, and benchmarks, and basically thresholds as we're moving through the system so that we can actually track what's taking place through this transition process so that when we're ultimately at the point of IPSAS compliance, that we can actually state this. One of the things that we're doing is training. Well, the discipline and the rigor required by IPSAS increases the professionalism of the staff and management. I can assure you that the training that we're providing is at the collegiate level for individuals that maybe have never really been exposed to anything other than just their individual processes. The last piece here, and I just can't overemphasize this, is what we are able to do is to increase the effectiveness and efficiency of operations. We were in an African country in June, and we spent a week basically going through sessions of helping people understand what needs to happen and where they are in the process. And one of the things that really struck me is they clearly understand the concept of internal controls. There's no question about that. But the internal control process is very, very time consuming. It's very labor intensive. And what basically what we explained is once you implement IPSAS and implement the IT systems appropriate to IPSAS, is that you will see significant changes and transitions related to the move to your efficiency and effectiveness of the organization. Okay, so let's move to the next piece here. And so what's the problem? So the question is this sounds so wonderful. It's like, why isn't everyone doing that? Well, the simple answer is it is hard. It's really hard. It's time consuming. It takes a tremendous amount of resources to make this happen. So how do we get there? Well, we get there, and there is again, time and the commitment to full implementation is absolutely critical. Individuals that are at the ground level, they lack the training. They really sort of lack the understanding of what it takes to get from where they are to where they need to be. The other pieces of it, in terms of lack of legislative action, one of the sort of the fascinating things is there's much of what takes place in the accounting, in the general accounting areas within a country are actually dictated by legislation. And legislation essentially needs to change in the sense that there needs to be a commitment at the very high level within the government that they want to commit to accrual-based accounting. We were in Ethiopia pre-COVID. That was a project that got disrupted because of COVID and other things within the country. But they wanted to do it. But one of the things that was required is a change in legislative action. And what we mean by that is there was a law that basically said that they would be reporting based upon cash-based accounting systems. Well, to move to the next level, you clearly need to have the legislative action. The biggest sort of infrastructure issue is IT. Essentially, what these countries need to be able to do is to commit the resources, both money as well as personnel and skilled resources, to develop an infrastructure that essentially accommodates the IPSAS and the accrual-based accounting mechanisms. Now, what we're doing as consultants is really focusing on the last 2 points, is the training, as well as essentially the project management as these countries are actually moving to IPSAS. And the sort of the hard part is, as we're starting with talking to individual countries, is that, you know what, you think that this is easy, and then you start talking to these people and you realize that they haven't even thought about a tenth of the variables that actually are going to impact the implementation. Okay, go to the next slide. And so I kind of, while this is consulting activities that we're doing, I wanted to frame this from the perspective of a research study. So if we looked at a purpose statement, so the purpose is what strategies are necessary for the implementation of IPSAS standards in an emerging market country, and that's really sort of driving what we're doing. So how do we know what we know? Well, we know this through specific interviews with individuals. We've done numerous focus groups. We've done interactive training sessions, many interactive training sessions where we're communicating to the group in terms of what you need to do, and then understanding from them where the gaps are in terms of where we need to be and where they are, and understanding those gaps. We're certainly triangulating this with organizational reports, budget reports, financial statements, IT documentation. We're following up with site visits. We're actually doing walkthroughs of the various sites. And basically what we're looking at here are the results of a sort of an extensive review and implementation process with 2 African countries. Okay, so move on to the next slide here, and let's talk about this. So while this is not really framed in terms of a thematic analysis, I wanted to identify, so what are the things that we need to understand? What are the challenges? Well, the challenges first is the implementation of accrual-based system really entails multiple layers of complexity throughout the organization. Okay, there clearly needs to be a shift in public sector governance. And what we mean by this is the governmental sector, from the legislative down to the Ministry of Finance and others, really need to appreciate the fact that the way they do things are different. The only way this can get done is if there is a political support for the activities. And the reason that the political support is there is because the external stakeholders, again, World Bank, UN, and others, are actually demanding this. So there has to be a mechanism where at the governmental level, that the governments truly appreciate that this is important. And then finally, really just identifying the scope of the implementation. And one of the struggles that we have is, okay, so yes, we want to develop a governmental accounting financial statements. Well, what is included in that? Is it just the ministries? Is it based upon, and this is one of the things we're struggling with now, is it based upon programs? Is it based upon agencies? What is and is not a part of these comprehensive financial statements? And these questions are actually kind of interesting because they're questions that they probably haven't really thought through in the past. So we're kind of like working in a zone that is difficult to actually get our hands on in terms of understanding what the scope is. Okay, so if you want to go to the next slide. So what are some success factors? So what are some things that a country needs to do? Well, they need to really develop various oversight committees that essentially lead the process. We think about the steering committee. This is a very high level committee. Think about this based upon maybe a board of directors. This should have input from the legislature and input maybe from agencies that actually direct accounting standards. But the idea is that they are acting as if it is the board of directors. We need to have a technical implementation subcommittee. Generally, this is led by the Ministry of Finance, who's clearly in charge of the accounting related to what's taking place. And this implementation subcommittee is going to be responsible for bringing everything together. Now, one of the things that we discovered in one of our sessions when we were walking through and talking to each of these groups, IT and various groups within the various ministries, is that in a lot of cases, each of these little groups are actually doing good stuff in terms of the implementation process. The problem is that that wasn't communicated in terms of sort of a comprehensive strategy that then could be fed to the end goal of IPSAS requirements. So one of the things that the implementation subcommittee has to be responsible for is taking down those silos and making sure that everyone is actually working towards the final goal. We also need a technical committee, validation committee. As we are changing business processes, is that these business processes need to be tagged and monitored and tested so that the information that's being provided is actually appropriate. And all of these essentially are essential committees in response to the overall transition of IPSAS. If you want to go to the next slide. And so based upon this, the question becomes is, so what do we want to do? Well, we got a couple of slides here, and we'll talk through some of these in some detail, and others in not so much detail, but there's a couple of things that I think are very important. First of which is you can't do this unless there is a commitment to implement an appropriate information technology system. Okay, so the systems that they probably have right now are systems that are not designed to accommodate accrual-based accounting. There are systems that are out there such as ERPs, enterprise risk planning systems, and there's what we call the IFMS system, which is really geared directly towards the accounting for public sector entities. Why is this important? Well, this is important because what has to coincide with the implementation of IPSAS is a transition from manual business processes to business processes that are actually controlled by the IT system. So that's absolutely the key, and you can't do this unless the IT system is in place. And if it is in place, then you can move forward. Now, what we're doing right now is the system in place? No. Is it in process? Absolutely. So as we are adding new systems and completing the transition from an IT perspective, we're actually able to build these business processes such that we can actually accommodate this. Okay, now let me just kind of give you an example of how the business process and IT actually works together. So from an accrual-based accounting, when you order something, this should come from purchasing, So there has to be a purchasing function, and that should be embedded in the IT system. And when we create a purchase order, that needs to be embedded in the IT system, okay, as a purchase order. So this is a transaction. Now, it's not an accounting transaction, but it is there. But what happens when we receive the item? Well, the receiver is going to be receiving the purchase order embedded in the IT system. And at the point of receiving, what do we have? Well, we should have an increase in inventory or an increase in supplies. So that is going to increase. And at the same time, we're creating a liability related to this, because what the system essentially is saying is that at the point of receiving, that item is then on our books as a business transaction. Well, obviously they're not doing this in a cash-based system because they're not tracking supplies or inventory as a separate item, and they're not tracking accounts payable or payables as a separate item in the system. So this is a change in mindset. This is a change in business processes, and it entails, think about all the complexities. Well, we've got to have human resources essentially defined the roles of what every individual and every function within the organization is needed. We need to develop the range of access controls within the IT system based upon the job. And then we need to essentially train people to understand that they have to do their jobs within the IT system and not outside. So purchasing can't just, or the departments can't just call up and order goods and expect those to be paid. There has to be the tracking mechanism of the purchase order, which is embedded in the IT system. And then when it's received, there needs to be a business process in place such that the receiver is actually inputting the and acknowledging the receipt of this within the business system. And then when it's paid, is the accounts payable clerk needs to be able to match basically what the invoice is, what was received, and what was ordered. So this is a business process embedded in an IT system, embedded in a organizational process that is totally different from what's taking place. But the great thing is, once this is in place, the organization is much better served than what's taking place. One of the transition steps, and I'm just looking at my time here. I could talk for hours about this, but we don't have hours. I think, when do we finish up? We finish up at 3:30 or 2:30 or?
So we finish up in about 13 minutes.
Oh, okay. So I was thinking I had another 40 minutes.
Oh.
So okay, I don't want to. Okay, so that's fine. Okay, so there's like 3 pages of this. I just gave one example of it. One of the sort of the big hard parts of this is tracking assets. Okay, so when you think about a country, think about all the assets that they have. Buildings, equipment, land, and they've never tracked those before. So building a system that actually tracks the assets and then values the assets is a monumental task. So those are some of the things that we're working on. And I actually was thinking about titling this presentation is, roadmap to IPSAS implementation, lessons learned and lessons still learning. So, the Countri we're working with now, we've been with them for a year and a half or so. Chances are we'll be with them for the next 5 to 10 years till they're actually at that point. But what you're seeing here essentially is the framework that we're using, the ideas that we have, And what we really need to do in terms of getting our friends, our colleagues, our clients to the next level of IPSAS implementation. And I will tell you that the goal of IPSAS implementation, while far off, is a reachable goal. But I also am convinced that the process absolutely creates value for these countries as they're really sort of reimagining how they can do business in a global environment. Okay, so I want to leave some time for some comments, so we can just kind of move this to the end slide. And a lot of the stuff that we had already talked about. So again, I tend to ramble on here in terms of what's going on. So that's really what I wanted to do. The idea of this presentation is it really takes us out of the classroom and into the environment, and we're creating, hopefully we're creating a societal impact in terms of what we're doing in relationship to helping the lives of people in countries that are starting to be a part of the world. So how do we do this in terms of questions? I'll turn this back over to you.
Sure. Any questions that you may have, please enter them in the chat. And you can also unmute yourself and just chime in. So what started, I'll ask a question, Dr. Mayer, what started you with your passion in the countries that you're serving?
That's actually an interesting question. So I became involved with what's called the Financial Services Volunteer Corps. It's an NGO that actually provides financial resources, not financial resources, but financial training and so forth to emerging market countries. They're actually funded by the State Department. And I happened, I guess it was maybe back in 2014, I was at a conference in somewhere in Africa, I forget, but the woman that was sitting next to me, she goes, as I told her that I taught accounting and auditing and the stuff I was doing at Walden, and she says, "Oh, you're the kind of person that we're looking for. Would you like to volunteer?" And I said, "Sure." So I sent her my CV, and like a month later, FSBC called me and said, "Well, would you like to go to Tunisia?" And so I went to Tunisia, did training related to internal controls. So I've actually gone to Tunisia several times. I've gone to South Africa and a couple of places. And then I guess about 3 years ago, they contacted me and said, "Well, you know, we're working with a country that is interested in moving to international public sector standards." Okay, so you know, I know enough about the accrual-based accounting. I'm an accounting professor, and it's like, okay, well, that sounds interesting. Count me in. And my wife is also an accounting professor, so we ended up going to Ethiopia. We worked with them for about a year, and then you know, unfortunately, COVID happened, and then they went to war, and it was. So I'm not exactly sure what's taking place in Ethiopia now. We're now working with another country, and it's the interesting thing as we're working as a consultant. And I know we have a consulting capstone program within the DBA, which pretty much what we're doing, and it really follows that model, is there's a skill set in terms of consulting that is just, it's not easy, but it certainly does, if it's done right, hopefully we're at least getting close to doing this right. It really does create value to to our clients, and it certainly creates a value to us in the sense that yeah, we kind of know this. Well, we didn't know this when we started, but 4 or 5 years into the process, it's like, oh yeah, this is we can do this. We know exactly how to do this. So that's how we started. That's kind of a long answer to that.
Fantastic. What advice would you give for those on the line if they wanted to get started in such endeavors?
I think the issue becomes is you need to be going to research conferences. You need to be interacting with other researchers. Again, how did I make this connection? Well, it was just a happenstance connection when I was at a conference. So the issue becomes, and I think we have some doctoral students online here, is I always tell my students this, is when you get your doctoral degree, that's certainly is a goal, but that only gets you to the starting point of what you want to do with the rest of your career. So my recommendation is take your research, go out and talk to as many people as you can, apply for conferences, go to conferences, go to everywhere that you can and talk about this. And then between conferences and in the receptions and all this stuff, talk to everyone that you have, because these are the people that are going to take you to that next level. That's how I got into this. My wife and I, we have numerous research and professional partners that we identified in these research conferences. So don't just put your doctoral study on the shelf and look at it and say, oh, that's a wonderful thing that I did. Visualize that research study as the conduit to the rest of your career, at least not the rest of it, but at least the beginning of the next phase of your career. So you got to meet people, you got to reach out to them, you got to make the connections, you got to talk to people, and you do that, it will be interesting to see sort of what direction what path you actually end up with.
Great advice. Anybody else have any questions? We have a few moments left. All right. Well, I would like to thank you, Dr. Mayer, for carving out time for this fabulous presentation. It's been wonderful learning more about your pursuits, and I know that it was well received. And those listening to this recording, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to Dr. Mayer.